Hello everyone and welcome to the Future Space. I'm your host, Daniel Fox. Our guest today is Richelle Ellis. Richelle is an expeditionary artist, curator, and analog astronaut. She explores life at all levels of living systems, organisms, social structures, ecosystems, and planetary systems to illuminate the interdependence and complexity that bind them. Her work examines neural-like networks of connectivity, revealing intricate interwoven patterns that span disciplines and scales. By visually interpreting these structural relationships, she creates narratives that integrate the biological, social, and technological systems that shape our shared existence on Earth. She is the head of creative research for the analog space missions Hawaii Space Exploration Analog and Simulation, HI-SEAS, Sensoria Program, Lunares Research Station, and Astroland Interplanetary Agency. Richelle is the co-founder of In-ploration, a non-profit art and space initiative that deepens community appreciation for a planet by fostering new perspective. Her work spans exhibitions at the Museum of Contemporary Art Tokyo, Venice Biennale, and the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, with recent artworks on the surface of the moon and adhered to an asteroid. Wow, Richelle, welcome to the Future Space.
Awesome, so good to be here.
Richelle, what would be your 3 words that capture the essence of space?
First word, existential. As we all look up in the stars, there's that question of belonging, where we feel at home in the universe, and at the very same time, we feel so separate from it. The second word for me is incomprehensible. I think that so much about space is hard to fathom, and that is also why it's the most incredible platform for us to explore together, because it pushes all of us out of our comfort zone. The last word I would say is challenging. It's perhaps one of the hardest pursuits to evolve our evolutionary story off-world. Just as when we left the primordial goo in the very beginning, leaving the cradle of Earth is that next step forward. And it's challenging. It's hard. There's going to be a lot of trial and error. And I think because it's so difficult is why it's so exciting.
It is certainly challenging and exciting, and we're right in that time where we're opening slightly that door, having kind of a peek at what's coming. And I hope you and I are going to be able to live until we see one of the big giant leaps, because right now we're teasing that door, but there's still quite of a leap needed to be able to take it to the next level. Have you always looked up to the sky and felt connected, or felt humbled, or felt separated?
I'm glad you asked that, because I think a lot of people start to join the space community because of their fascination for the stars and for the cosmos. But what really drove me to explore space was actually from Earth gazing. I have just always loved seeing the world from different points of view. And, whether it was climbing to the top of a mountain and being able to look at the Earth from that perspective, or sitting on the airplane, gazing out the window and reflecting on how the landscape looks both like a cartoon game board, but also it replicates a circuit board. Like, there can be so many reads when you see things from a higher elevation. And then eventually that started to push me further and further out to learn concepts like the overview effect and seeing Earth from space, and realizing that single moment has everything that we ever needed. It's this living organism unto itself, and that we get to be like ants to the colony, like cells to the body of this greater system. And that's really where it came from. It's just this obsession with scaled systems, and realizing I'm not only part of it, but I also get to explore it at every level.
Did you ever watch on Netflix Love, Death and Robots, the episode of Zima Blue?
I did see that. It's phenomenal. It's absolutely incredible.
I think it's the best episode of the entire series, it truly captured how once we get to space, the stage now that is offered for art and that main character going from the simple to the super complex and going back to the simplicity. I thought it was a very, very profound piece, and I loved it.
Well, so much about that episode is also about the journey of the artist and how their practice evolved with them as he goes from being a robot inside of a swimming pool, painting the tiles blue, to then doing these large-scale immersive blue installations and then returning back to his robotic form. And eventually he passes away, if I remember correctly. But yeah, that story is so moving because it does bring in the journey component, which I think a lot of artists leave that part out of their artistic storytelling. The journey, the places, the sights and scenes, the nature, everything that you experience at a sensory level just comes alive in your art. And I don't know if there's much separation from the experience you have as the artist and then the outcomes of what you create. They're so entangled, and that's part of the beauty.
Talking about artists, what is the role of artists in a society? What is their place? And even more important, what is their role in telling the space story and trying to connect that world is ahead of us into our common world today?
I have come to know, actually, artists and scientists have this in common, that we oftentimes see or hear or experience things that others might miss. And I think those subtleties and those quiet qualities that surround us are enhanced through art and kind of showcased to enhance the human experience. And I love that gets to be in the hands of an artist, is to truly recognize what's here in front of us right now and how can we acknowledge our existence, our sense of belonging, our sense of social connection, our sense of beauty, and mirroring the world around us from the internal world to the external world. That is a gift of an artist. And what's amazing is we bring those guts of the internal experience forward so others can play with those sensations and visuals in the same way. And oftentimes that brings together this emotional connection that we all share. I love how performance philosopher Jason Silva, he's a big hero of mine. He talks often about how our stories, our songs, our poetry, they're maps from where we went. And I really think that that is the role of the artist, is to allow others to travel to these places emotionally and even physically through the experience of art itself. Now, where that comes into practice around society and moving society forward, I think it's really pivotal in enhancing our visions of what's possible and giving us a vision worth striving for. And that's what's led me to this interest in space, which has so often been a playground for visualizing futures that don't exist yet, thinking about what are the colors, what are the sounds, what is the sensation of a future that exists 50 to 100 years ahead of us. That enables us to imagine, and that capability has enabled us to evolve. Back to the story of why do we leave Earth and what role does space play? Space is the playground that pushes us to move further beyond what we think is possible. And I think that art provides that gateway and that imagination to take the action. And so a lot of people ask me, why do you want to bridge art and science? And I think they go hand in hand because the art helps create the sensory experience of what could be. And then the science and the technology can actually create that vision. And then together, when you start to bridge them, then you get the aesthetics and the complexity of where those worlds collide. And that's where some true innovation and magic can happen.
Do you think that was one of the successes of the Renaissance era in Italy, with the Medicis sponsoring artists to create that vision? They were able to marry science and the technologies of this world and express it into something that was bigger than the science and the technology.
I think it's an incredible gift, and it led to incredible outcomes with technology and with the leaders of the Renaissance, Leonardo da Vinci, being able to both dream up what flight systems could look like and then to physically model and build and calculate how these objects would move in the air. That combination was essential to make things that were otherwise inaccessible possible. So now we have flight, and now flight has become no big deal. We're all standing and complaining in lines at airports because it's such a part of our everyday experience, where at the time was something that seemed impractical, impossible, and unimaginable. But then you have these artists that ask, why not? And I think that question is a gateway to so much possibility. And I think actually that question of why not me, that's a huge driver in my own art practice, which has led me to do things I never thought possible.
You've had a front row seat that many don't have because you have a relationship with Tim, who was CEO of Relativity, and you got to have your artist mind embracing the engineering marvel of rocket building. How much of that perspective has been now infused into your work?
Oh, it has been fused into my entire life, as well as my entire life with Tim. So a lot of people don't actually know this story, but both he and I met in college. We were both giving TEDx talks, and I was talking about what is our role within a network society, thinking about systems in our planet, and he was talking about this crazy thing about reusable rockets before that became our common ground. And at that time, I thought his voice was sexy. We went on a few dates, and then we've been together ever since. But right after college, he and I wrote a business plan together, and we called it Relativity Gallery. And the idea was to bridge science and art because they have this relationship that helps inform one another. And in hindsight, it's probably good we did not sign a lease on Pioneer Square for this tiny store that is now a chocolate shop. I ended up going to some art residencies, and then Tim started to think more about 3D printing and built out that program at Blue Origin before setting off with Jordan Noon to create Relativity Space. But that has always been integrated into my vision, his vision, and our collective vision of what we want our lives to orient around. So much so that it even became ingrained in our wedding, and it's part of our connection. Is we've always thought the intersection of art and science is like a Venn diagram, and the overlap is wonder. And so it's funny because when we first started, I definitely was in the arts circle and he was in the science circle, and then we had wonder. But I think now we've actually been tourists in each other's orbits, and now I'm doing the astronaut training and a lot of research-based art practices, and he is now getting really into photography and some other things, and has always been really into screenwriting and filmmaking. He actually thought that was going to be his major in college. So we've always had this synergy, and even the house that we've built together, it contains artistic paintings and trinkets that are scientific. There's just so much beauty in the way that technology mimics nature and nature mimics technology, and all of that to me is an art form unto itself, celebrating the aesthetics, the complexity, those details. So it's really just become a way of life.
Let's talk a little bit more about, you have exploration, a lot of seeking these new territories, but also you co-founded a company and where you were just at the Venice Biennale, and it's In-ploration.
So In-ploration was a project that came about actually during lockdown, during COVID. A friend of mine, who's the dean of the USC school, Haven Lynn Kirk, realized that my interest in art and aerospace worked really well with my now co-founder, Lawrence Azarad's interest in music, space, and design thinking. So she put us together, and at the time we would just have Zoom calls where we were really excited about talking about the Golden Record Project and the work that he did, because he was the creative director director in the re-release of the public Golden Record, which was the first time there was public access to this archive. He designed a beautiful book, an album, won a Grammy for it. But when I was talking to him, I was telling him how I sent some art into space. I was really curious to do more expeditions where I could learn more astronaut training. And then I had also witnessed the acceleration of relativity space, which was a seed of an idea, to witnessing a rocket launch in spring of 2023 or 2022. It's a little bit blurry now. 23. And, really seeing what's possible when you turn in an idea into a reality. So at the time, he and I were going to start writing a book, and I told him about this idea of in-ploration, that just as we explore and have outward discovery, what are we doing to implore and understand our own relationship to the greater cosmos? So we began to collect a lot of different interviews from artists, astronauts, systems thinkers, futurists, designers, musicians, and we really wanted to hear about their own relationship to the cosmos. And before we knew it, we started to develop a nonprofit art and space initiative, and we received some support from our incredible In-ploration Founders Fund, and they were like, this needs to be something bigger. This is less of just an idea, but this needs to be a big part of the integration phase of why we travel to space. We focus so much on the technology component of why do we go to space, but what's the cultural significance? And with In-ploration, it's devised of 4 parts. We're working on the art book, which will be published in fall of 2026. We have an amazing publisher, Delmonico Books, who distributes around these incredible museums and science centers, so we'll be able to get the word out. We just released an LP soundtrack featuring incredible musicians like Suzanne Chani, Esperanza Spalding, a track from Wilco and Tori Moi, among others, that gives the kind of sensory experience of listening within. And then the third component was about bringing these ideas of space and futures thinking into educational programs. So we did a design sprint with Cranbrook Arts Academy, but then teamed up with MIT Media Lab and built a lunar mission control station that connected to several creative payloads that were sent to the moon. And the structure itself looks like an artwork. So we wanted to rethink a traditional mission control station, which is just stacks of screens and is very hard to, it's quite intimidating. But we wanted this to be an art experience, so people walk into this dome-like structure that looks like the structure of the moon and is made out of basalt rock that feels like you're on the moon, and watch these screens of payloads that are literally in space and you can interact with them. So the third piece, education. The last piece is a multimedia exhibit. So this is the grand finale we're working on. We're talking to a lot of museums about bringing these artists into a large-scale exhibit. And this includes artists like Lita Albuquerque, who is fascinated with land art and travels to the North Pole and South Pole to make artworks. We also have artwork by James Turrell, who uses light, and he's actually trained as a pilot. And so he's really inspired by flight and how that has reoriented his relationship to seeing the Earth's light and seeing that from various vantage points and bringing that perspective home. Another artist, Azuma Makato, makes these incredible bonsais that flow up to the stratosphere that are representing Japanese cultures in space. Another artist, Guo-Qiang, who does a piece called Sky Ladder, which uses explosives to build a ladder to the stars. So we have just been in awe and amazement by the community that's come around these ideas. And Frank White, who coined the overview effect, dear friend and mentor, has written the foreword of our book, and he talks about how he didn't realize that in-ploration is a key ingredient to the overview effect, because so many of these astronauts go to space, they see the Earth from above, and they start to see how interconnected it is and the beauty and awe and wonder of it as a living system, and become stewards for our only home. But he talks about how that's not only a physical sensation, but it's the integration and internal processing of that experience that is so key to complete that overview effect. So I was very thrilled to hear that inploration is a key part of that process, and it's something that I hope this project with Inploration can provide for many people, because we all deserve to have these overview effect moments. And if we can experience that through art and design and music and celebrations together, then I've done my job.
It resonates a lot. I wrote a piece in my book about shadows, and I'm sitting at the top of a mountain and I'm seeing the sun go away and the shadows spreading over the valley and unifying everything that is divided. Right? The light is amazing, but at the same time it divides everything. It separates everything. It even separates us from the cosmos. Like if we lived in a world where light was 24 hours a day, we would never see there's something grander above us. So it's only by stepping into the shadow of the earth that our connection with the universe is revealed. And the parallel that I make in the story is also, it's by stepping into our own shadow that our connection to something that is bigger is revealed. Because when we get into those shadows, we're all the same. And we can even look at today's technology being the light. And it's great, right? You don't want to dismiss everything that we're capable of doing with technology and with the light. But at the same time, it lacks that depth that can only be achieved when we go into the vulnerability of these places that forces us to step outside of our comfort zone. And I had several conversations with Frank about, could we recreate the overview effect on the planet? And my answer was no, you can't, because you can visually replicate or simulate what you're seeing, but the impact and the transformation happens because you go into an unknown place where it's vulnerable, you haven't experienced, and that vulnerability is what allows the transformation. The inploration is always very much part of that process of transformation. And even I wrote a story about the metaphor of the butterfly, because we're always so keen and so quick to talk about how we can become our own butterfly, soar and spread your wings. But we always forget to mention how the butterfly becomes a butterfly. It's not like magically you wake up and you go and say, I can fly. You start by being a caterpillar, literally crawling on the ground. And then when they're ready to make their transition, they have to isolate themselves. They have to create the space for the transformation to happen. They have to build that little cocoon, and where in that cocoon, they will literally unbecome what they were so that they can become something new. And then I even push it further. When they're ready to come out of the cocoon, again, it's not magically. No, they have to break themselves out of that cocoon, and the struggle of coming out, that effort, is actually a necessary part, because they made some tests of if they were cutting the cocoon, the butterflies that would come out actually would be weaker and less resilient because they haven't built up their resilience. So now you're out of the cocoon, you're still not a fully butterfly. You're at the most vulnerable place because now you're exposed, you're outside of your cocoon, but your wings are still shriveled and you can't fly anywhere. So you have to be basically vulnerable to the world on this little piece of leaf while your wings stretches and get full of blood. And only then can you start flying. But that's not the end of the story. That's just a new world. Because you can take your flight and then the bird comes down and then you still can fail after becoming a butterfly. The butterfly is just the idea that you can do more, but it's not the end goal, right? It's just a new world. So the transformation is always the most forgotten part, but it's always the most important part of the exploration.
I love that you're bringing this up because I think this is also a big part of what's left out of the space conversation, and it is the shadows. What kind of experiences drive us to do such extreme, challenging things? Where does that originate, and how do you go from the caterpillar to the butterfly where you're busting your wings out because you just have to, and it's inevitable? I do think that As I've been working on this project In-ploration and I've been telling it to people, they've been like, well, how do you implore in your own life? And I will say the last several years for both Tim and I were very much a phase of drastic change, transformation, and the only way was through with just doing things we never thought possible, but it was also so challenging and hard and took so much grit. And at the same time, we were both exploring our own personal stories of our family of origin. And, it really became this journey where you start to ask your questions. For example, why as an artist do I send art to space? And that has come up many times. And then I realized it's not only about pushing the boundlessness of creativity and seeing what's possible, but a lot of it comes from my own shadows of what is my sense of belonging and what is my sense of home and where is home and what is art, and does it matter if it's seen or experienced or if it just exists? What if my art is on an asteroid going into deep space? Does it matter? And these types of questions are actually much more existential than just the surface component, which is, let me do a hard thing and see if it works. And through that process of self-reflection, I've wondered in the broader space community how many of us are driven by some of these shadows. And I think there's a lot of potential darkness that leads us to the light. And as you're saying, you can only see stars when there's night. And I think that resilience really does push us beyond what we think is possible.
We're defined by the hardships of life. Everybody can have good times, but it's the hardships of life that really define whether you come out stronger. I mean, in a relationship as a society, you and I were briefly talking about what we're going through right now, but it reminded me of the first season of Westworld, where I rarely had a connection to a show as the first season. The second season and the third season, they shot themselves in the foot because now they make something. The value of it was in the first season, and then they fell victim of their own narrative. But the idea, the value was in the suffering. And that is the most important thing that we need to bring back into our stories, is the value of the suffering. Not everyone is rich, not everyone is successful, not everyone is accomplished, but every single human on this planet has suffered or is suffering, whether you're rich, whether you're Bill Gates, whether you're Bezos, whether you're anyone. Suffering is that great unifier of the world. And as we go to space, we need to be honest about these feelings of abandonment that are normal. When people say, oh, you guys want to go to space, what about us? Which is nothing different than when you have one of your siblings that goes to New York City and you have the others that say, oh, so our little village is not good enough, you have to go to the big city, because it forces all the others to put themselves in relationship to that movement. So these conversations need to happen. Not only they need to happen, but we need to value their presence in our journey of transformation.
There is some extreme value in that analogy of the sibling that moves to the big city from a small town. It also is so empowering to see other people going for it, and especially going for it from a place that is not of privilege and from a place of just sheer grit and determination and just the power of inspiration. I think we can focus so much on the challenges of our world, and of course there's a lot of critique of why go try to solve things for space when we have so many problems on Earth. But I think there needs to be a reframe of, well, what are we fighting for? When we start to think about futures that start to integrate an evolution that travels beyond Earth, then it completely changes the framework of how we're seeing ourselves relative to everything. And I think that unlocking can be such a source for inspiration, whether or not we leave Earth or not. It's just expanding creative thinking and giving that to more people. That has a lot of power to move the needle. And yes, I mean, this is a very complex discussion too around, I'm an environmentalist. I grew up in a small mountain town. I make a lot of art with sustainable materials and, really try to be responsible in that practice, and just a deep, profound love of nature. And that's why all my art is about nature and how we need to celebrate and cherish the inhabitants that we share this planet with. But I think this conversation around conservation often leads to deceleration as being the answer. We need to slow down tech. We need to slow down progress. We need to slow things down and go back to what was, which I think is an admirable point of view, and I can understand that perspective. But it is also quite counter to our evolutionary story, which is always about trying to go further and further, no matter what species you're looking at. Whenever I'm trying to unlock ideas around politics, I just look at nature. And I think you do the same, Daniel. And so, yeah, the idea is if acceleration and becoming more space-oriented is the next evolutionary story for humanity and for other life forms, then yeah, how can we do it in a way that's driven by inspiration and beauty and intrigue and compassion and empathy, and not just have it driven by wealth and commerce and opportunity? I think there needs to be many different perspectives brought into the story around space. And that's why I've started to haul artists into these groups of conversations. And, a range of speakers and presenters in the In-ploration project come from indigenous backgrounds, Afrofuturists. There's pulling in celestial wisdom from their ancestors and seeing how does this relate to what's happening today, and how can we use this wisdom now, but also remix it to fit where we are here. And I think to clean your hands and say, space and progress is not for environmentalists, or it's not for me, is a missed opportunity, because I think it's a part of our evolution story, whether we like it or not. And so we might as well be contributing and participating in the conversation to see what must be done in these next phases of space exploration.
The narrative that we've created about our species, I think for me, has been so flawed, and the environmental movement is partially quite responsible for it. Ironically, in the 70s, before the 70s, they were pro-nuclear, and then after that they became against nuclear. And it's wondering, what our dependence on fossil fuel would be today had we actually continued embracing the technology and try to figure out how to utilize it, as opposed to shy away from it and go to something that ended up actually doing quite a lot of damage. Nature, we were talking a little bit about nature earlier, and we're so quick to say that human nature is bad and nature is good. But the reality is the part in us that we don't like is actually nature in its purest form. Our human nature is what we should be celebrating. The empathy, compassion, the fact that we take care of people who have less opportunities or maybe weaker. Because the reality of nature, like as we said before, it doesn't care. It's purely you win or you lose. And that was one of the dangers of science back in the times of eugenics, is because they look at nature, they look at how nature works when they say, eugenics makes sense because it's exactly how nature went. And we went in and said, no, we don't want the world to be like this because we want to bring more compassion and more empathy. And so I think that collectively we need to reshape the story of who we are, what's our place into the world and what we can bring. And remembering, if we don't accept our model of growth right now, the solution is not stop growth, because life inevitably grows. There's nothing that cannot grow. So if you don't like that growth, then you have to figure out what kind of growth you want to give it.
And if you don't grow, you die.
That's the thing. It's so for 20, 30, 40 years, the story that we've been telling people is that we have to stop growth, or we have to rewind the clock. And ultimately, everybody notices that you can't do that. It's impossible. So you all kind of retreat into this place of denial. No one wants to talk about the elephant in the room. And it just does worse than actually as if you're going in to say, all right, we need to figure out how to grow. And we have to make it with more understanding of that reciprocity with the world. But we can't go and hide ourselves into a closet and wish that the world was back into the past, because we romanticize the past. It's like we romanticize the relationships that we broke up, and we only remember the good times, and during the hard times with a new boyfriend, then we go, oh my God, yeah, was it that bad? No, it's only because you're picking and choosing what you want to remember.
There's a reason why you broke up.
There's a reason why you broke up. And today we enjoy nature because we're in the place of privilege to enjoy nature. We don't depend on it the same way that we did back then. We can just take the good and the bad, and we can go back to our little house and place of convenience. So that story has to change. That's what you're talking about, right?
Exactly. And I think I'm glad you pushed this idea forward, because I'm a huge advocate for continuing acceleration. However, while that is happening, we do need to pay our attention towards restoration and conservation. Because if you just accelerate and you just erase the rest, then that is not sustainable. And so I'm just so inspired by the conversations that have started to emerge with environmental groups where, for example, Sylvia Earle, incredible oceanographer, she founded an organization that creates hope spots, which basically serve as national parks at the sea. They're sanctuaries for the oceans. Now, commercially, people want to eat fish, and we want access to fisheries, and we want to be able to use the resources of the ocean. And I think there has been this sort of reframing where we can create these protective zones and rebuild and restore these populations, but then the fisheries get to have the benefit of what drifts beyond those protected areas. That's kind of the meeting of minds, is, hey, look, we both get a benefit. You can accelerate and feed the population. It is part of our advanced evolution that we know how to fish really, really well. But in order to have your fish, we need these beautiful protected zones where the life can flourish and continue to flourish forever, so that we can continue to all be here. So I think there's just these nuances that get cut out of the environmental conversation. The same is true with like bird and wildlife sanctuaries. A lot of those protected areas that inspire so many bird watchers from around the world are actually created as well for hunting. And so it's this yin and yang, and that creates such polarization, but the outcome means that this gets to exist, thrive, and we still get the incredible biodiversity of the world. And I think that these are the types of conversations that need to come up more and more around politics, but even around environmentalism and space exploration. Like, we need to start to stitch together why all of these factors of acceleration and restoration need to go hand in hand. I guess that's what we're getting to.
It was interesting. It reminded me of people forget that one of the reasons why they enjoy the outdoors in the US is because they have national parks that they can go to. We've made a decision to create those environments accessible to the public so that they could go and enjoy it. And they can get that connection and that physicality and being reminded why it's important, which is one of the reasons why, for me, it's extremely important that, yes, now that Antarctica is more accessible to the public, they need to go and experience that. You're increasing the numbers of tourism. It's a double-edged sword. But the tourism money helps the conservation, and when they go over there and they get to experience it with the context of education, they get to physically experience why these places matter. And so much of our relationship with nature and the narrative of the environmental movement has been rooted in righteousness. It's us, we have to save the ocean, we have to do this, and it's really black and white. And it's not that it takes away the urgency and the necessity to change, but this has to change from a place of righteousness to a place of humility, understanding that we could do whatever we want to do, but we choose to make a world like this because it's a more enjoyable world to have this relationship with the wildlife and with nature. And it's just a different narrative that brings people to the table rather than start pointing fingers at everyone, because nobody wants to get the finger pointed at them.
And to take it back to art, as a fellow passenger on the Space to Sea voyage to Antarctica, of course, going and watching the humpback whales and the orcas go by the ships and just being in awe of these glaciers that are the size of some of the largest buildings of our planet and more. That sensory experience is so awakening, empowering, and does kind of reinvigorate this stewardship for home. But I also want to dare to say that art can also bring you to those places and spaces without you even having to leave your home. I mean, you might have to leave your home to go to a gallery or a museum.
So what are you working on right now?
Yes. So I'm very excited. I have moved into a larger studio because I want to be doing larger sculptures and projects. I have been very inspired by Cyan Proctor's concept of Earthlight. She is a friend and was a fellow analog astronaut until she became a citizen astronaut and flew to space with SpaceX a few years ago. But she talks about just how the moon has moonlight that reflects onto you. The Earth has Earthlight, which is this blue light that encapsulates you when you are in space. And to me, I'm like, oh my gosh, how do we create art installations and experiences to bring Earthlight home so we can all bask in that beauty? And so I've started to do a series of built-in airplane windows with blue backlight. So they create these city scenes of different places around the world, but then the boxes themselves are illuminated, so you get to feel what it feels like to be an Earthlight. I also just finished yesterday an artwork that will go on an asteroid later this year. That was a fun project because it helps you think about, what is our story from Earth to space and to deep space. I hadn't done a project for deep space yet. So I ended up creating this container that's carrying other creative payloads. And the artwork around it is exploring systems, because as a systems thinker, I love how the systems of our Earth is what makes it livable, and systems exist at the micro to macro scale. So how can we celebrate that within a greater solar system? And so I reference circuit boards, the cells of a leaf, the skin texture on our body, and then a satellite view of a city scene. And each of those have very similar structural properties in the ways that these kind of fractal light patterns emerge. And so it's kind of like this, I want to say, postcard from Earth. And then at the very bottom of this pyramid is a thumbprint, but it's actually a digitized thumbprint, much to what we use for opening tablets, that acts as like a seed to a tree of life. And so it's this idea that our humanity, our technology, and our society are built on these systems, and that is what has enabled us to thrive and evolve here on Earth. And how can we showcase that message in space and celebrate it? We need to celebrate these incredible milestones and incredible advances for what we have experienced and evolved in just such a short amount of time here on Earth as humanity, but alongside many other Earth's inhabitants.
I always say that the nature of the universe is no different than the nature here on Earth. Why would it be different? It's one little cell in a big organism, and the fundamentals of life on Earth are nothing different than what it is. It's just a different scale. And if life drive on Earth is to connect, then it wants to connect beyond the planet. And for the first time in billion years that we know of, there's one species that we know that is about to take it beyond and continue that story. And to your point, that is to be celebrated. The universe is begging to be disrupted. There's nothing special about a universe that is barren of life. That would be such a waste of time. So that's why the scale and the size of it is, because there's no engineering of it other than time and scale. All these different trials and errors that are happening everywhere, trillions and trillions, for what? So that one place, somewhere, the pieces will line up and will create something that can start connecting to the beyond. And we're at the center of that. And so that's why I think that we need to celebrate the responsibility and what we're about to do. We're about to take life beyond and bring our humanity and nature with it and doing the best of it. Richelle, what would be your 3 words of wisdom?
What came up for me is creativity is boundless. And that to me just indicates that there are no limits to where we can go, how we can create, what things can be made of, what futures can be built. Our limits are the limits that we give to ourselves. So let's keep pushing those limits, and space offers limitless possibilities. So that's where they can go hand in hand.
And you have a full life ahead of you to push those boundaries and to take that creativity to new heights, new tools, new technology. And I can only imagine where art is going to be taken in the next 50 years. But I do believe that every single big company should have an artist in residence. So
Definitely.
Are you going to be back at the Venice Biennale next year? Is that something every year now, or?
I hope so. So what's exciting is the Venice Biennale is now launching a universe pavilion. This year was the first time kind of testing this out to see what does it mean when all countries and nations can be represented in one pavilion. So it's a testing bed, and they're hoping to build more programming around these themes of space, architecture, art, and bringing together many perspectives around the world. So I'm really excited to see what they do next and hope to be an active member in helping shape that story.
Amazing. And where can people find your art? Have a studio or online?
Yes, if you go to RichelleEllis.com, you can find my artwork there. I'm also on Instagram at Richelle Ellis Art, and Twitter, Richelle Ellis Art.
Richelle, it's been fun.
This was really fun.
Looking forward for our next chat together.
You got it. Maybe in the Galapagos.
Maybe in the Galapagos.